Shadows of Lacon City. Dusk descended on Lacon City, wrapping its streets in a suffocating gloom. The faint flicker of streetlights struggled to pierce through the mist that blanketed the narrow alleyways, while the rhythmic echo of hurried footsteps betrayed the unease of its inhabitants. This city was more than just bricks and mortar. It was a living, breathing embodiment of fear and prejudice, where justice wore a mask of authority and silence was survival. At the heart of this urban labyrinth was the Lacon City Police Department, a fortress of faded concrete and cracked windows. Inside, officers moved with mechanical precision, their eyes hardened by years of perceiving the world through a lens of suspicion. For them, the city was divided into two groups: the enforcers of order and the perpetrators of chaos. Among these officers was Jack Langston, a man whose name struck equal parts fear and dread. Jack was no ordinary officer. He was a legend, albeit a grim one. His reputation was built on his ruthless efficiency and an unyielding belief in his mission. To Jack, the world was black and white, order against chaos, law against disorder, and himself against the other. He had grown accustomed to wielding authority like a weapon, crushing any resistance under his boot. That evening, Jack sat in his patrol car parked at the edge of one of the city's most troubled neighborhoods. The radio crackled with the monotony of routine calls, but Jack's focus was elsewhere. His piercing gray eyes scanned the dimly lit streets, searching for any sign of trouble. Trouble, in his mind, always came in a certain form: those who didn't belong, who disrupted the fragile illusion of order he sought to maintain. Then came the call. Disturbance reported at Millstone Park. Female suspect, possible altercation. Jack's lips curled into a cold smile. The park was a known hotspot for the city's undesirables. Without hesitation, he started the car, the engine's growl echoing through the silent streets. As he turned the corner into the park, his headlights illuminated a silhouette that gave him pause. Under the dim glow of a street lamp stood a girl on crutches, her fragile frame leaning against a wooden bench. Beside her, a towering horse grazed quietly, its calm demeanor a stark contrast to the tension that hung in the air. The sight irritated Jack. It wasn't the presence of the girl or the horse that bothered him. It was the audacity of their existence in a place he deemed unfit for them. He stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the gravel path. The girl turned to face him, her wide eyes betraying a mixture of fear and defiance. She tightened her grip on the crutches, her knuckles white against the worn wood. "What are you doing here?" Jack barked, his voice sharp enough to cut through the night. "I'm just waiting," the girl replied, her voice trembling but steady. "I'm not causing any trouble." Jack's eyes narrowed. He didn't trust her words. To him, everyone in this neighborhood was guilty until proven innocent, a philosophy that had guided his actions for years. He took a step closer, his hand instinctively brushing against the taser on his belt. Waiting for what? Trouble, he sneered. "No," she said, her voice rising slightly. "For a friend. That's all." The horse, sensing the rising tension, lifted its head and let out a soft snort. Jack's gaze shifted to the animal, and his irritation deepened. Its presence felt like a challenge, a silent defiance of his authority. "Get that thing out of here," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. The girl shook her head, her courage faltering. "She's not hurting anyone. Please, we'll leave soon." But Jack was no longer listening. Her words were noise to him, meaningless in the face of his escalating anger. In his mind, her refusal was an act of defiance, a challenge to his authority that needed to be crushed. He unholstered his taser, the cold metal a familiar weight in his hand. "I'm not asking again," he said, his voice now cold and mechanical. "Please," she whispered, a hint of desperation creeping into her tone. "We're not doing anything wrong." Jack's patience snapped. Without warning, he pulled the trigger. The taser's crackling discharge split the air, followed by a sharp cry as the girl crumpled to the ground. Her crutches clattered beside her, and the horse let out a loud, mournful whinny. As Jack stood over her, his chest heaving with the adrenaline of the moment, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Her tear-streaked face, twisted in pain and fear, stirred a discomfort he couldn't quite name. It was as though, for a brief moment, the walls he had built around himself began to crack. But he pushed the feeling aside. To admit doubt was to admit weakness, and Jack Langston had no room for weakness. "Get out of here," he muttered, turning back toward his car. "And don't come back." He didn't wait to see if she could rise, or if the horse would follow. As he drove away, the sound of his tires on the gravel drowned out the girl's quiet sobs. The city's shadows swallowed her whole, leaving Jack alone with a hollow victory and a creeping sense of unease. Little did he know, the events of that night would mark the beginning of a journey that would force him to confront the very darkness he had spent his life trying to impose on others. The ripples of a gunshot. The night after the incident, Lacon City seemed unusually still, but it was an illusion. Beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. Jack Langston sat in his patrol car, parked on a quiet stretch of road, staring into the void beyond the windshield. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the dim glow of the dashboard. He told himself it was just another day, just another routine, but the faint tremor in his fingers betrayed him. The girl's face haunted him. The way she'd looked at him with a mixture of fear and defiance, the tear-streaked cheeks, and the quiet question in her eyes. Why? Jack shook his head, as though he could physically dislodge the thought. He was a cop, a protector of order. He'd done what needed to be done, hadn't he? The question lingered, unwelcome and persistent. The next morning, a city reacts. By dawn, the echoes of the gunshot had reached beyond Millstone Park. A small crowd had gathered at the site where the girl's horse, Princess, had fallen. Candles flickered in the early morning light, surrounded by a growing pile of flowers, handwritten notes, and photographs. Among the mourners were local residents, activists, and curious onlookers. They whispered in hushed tones, recounting what they'd heard or read online. A photo of the girl, hunched over her horse, her face etched with grief, had gone viral overnight. Social media platforms were ablaze with outrage. She was defenseless. A woman murmured, shaking her head as she knelt to place a bouquet of daisies by the makeshift memorial. And her horse. What did the poor animal do to deserve this? A young man with a camera slung around his neck captured the scene, his face set in grim determination. This isn't just about her. It's about all of us. This city has tolerated this kind of brutality for too long. The girl's name surfaced online. Amina Jones. Her story, pieced together by reporters and witnesses, painted a picture of resilience and tragedy. A young woman who had faced loss after loss, yet still found solace in her horse and her volunteer work at an animal shelter. She was known for her kindness, her willingness to help others despite her own struggles. By mid-morning, her story had caught the attention of local news stations. A reporter stood in front of the growing memorial, her voice somber as she addressed the camera. This morning, Lacon City is grappling with the fallout of a police incident that has left many questioning the use of force. Amina Jones, a 22-year-old on crutches, was reportedly tasered by Officer Jack Langston before her horse was fatally shot. Jones was allegedly waiting for a friend at Millstone Park when the encounter occurred. Jack faces the fallout. At the police station, the atmosphere was tense. Officers avoided Jack's gaze, their conversations halting when he walked into the room. The precinct's usual hum of activity felt subdued, weighed down by the unspoken tension. Jack's supervisor, Captain Morales, summoned him to her office. She was a stern woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. Jack sat across from her, his back straight, his face a mask of indifference. "Langston," Morales began, her voice low and even. "Do you have any idea what kind of firestorm you've ignited?" Jack shrugged. "I was doing my job." She was where she shouldn't have been. Morales leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Your job is to enforce the law, not escalate situations. We've got protests brewing, activists calling for your badge, and a public relations nightmare on our hands. This department is already under scrutiny, and you've just poured gasoline on the fire." Jack's jaw tightened. She was resisting. She was on crutches. Morales snapped, slamming her hand on the desk. "And you shot her horse. Do you have any idea how that looks? The media is having a field day with this. You're off the streets, effective immediately." "What?" Jack's voice rose, the first crack in his stoic facade. "You're on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Turn in your badge and gun." Jack's world seemed to tilt. He opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. He stood, pulled his badge from his belt, and placed it on the desk with a metallic clink. As he walked out of the office, he felt the weight of his coworkers' eyes on him. Amina's recovery. Meanwhile, Amina lay in a hospital bed, her body aching and her spirit battered. The taser wounds on her skin were a stark reminder of the violence she had endured. Her mind replayed the events in the park like a broken record. The coldness in Jack's eyes, the flash of the taser, the sound of the gunshot that had ended Princess's life. A nurse entered the room, her face soft with sympathy. "How are you feeling, Amina?" "I'm fine," Amina replied automatically, though her voice lacked conviction. The nurse hesitated. "You've had visitors all morning. People from the shelter, a few reporters. They want to talk to you, if you're up for it." Amina shook her head. "Not now. I can't." Her voice broke, and she turned her face away. The nurse nodded understandingly and left the room. Amina stared at the ceiling, tears slipping down her cheeks. She felt hollow, as though a part of her had been ripped away and replaced with an unbearable emptiness. The protests begin. By evening, the streets of Laeken City were alive with the sound of protest. Hundreds gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read, "Justice for Amina," and "No more police brutality." Chants of "Say her name" filled the air, echoing off the buildings. The protesters were a diverse group, young and old, students and professionals, locals and activists from neighboring cities. Among them was Elena Rivera, a community organizer who had spent years fighting for police reform. "This isn't just about Amina," Elena said into a megaphone. "This is about a system that allows people like Jack Langston to act with impunity. It's about the lives destroyed by unchecked power. And we're here to say, enough." The crowd roared in agreement, their voices a powerful wave of anger and hope. Jack's reflection. At home, Jack sat in the darkness of his living room, the muffled sound of the protests reaching his ears. He stared at the television, where images of the crowd outside the station flickered across the screen. The chants seemed to grow louder, even through the walls of his house. For the first time in years, Jack felt something he couldn't ignore. A gnawing doubt, a seed of guilt that took root in the silence. He thought of Amina's face, her whispered plea, and the rage in her eyes as she cradled her dying horse. The walls he had built around himself, the justifications he had clung to, began to crack. And in that silence, a question emerged, louder than the protests, more piercing than any chant. What have I become? The weight of consequences. The streets of Laeken City burned with energy as the protests swelled in size and intensity. Days of demonstrations had brought the city to a standstill, and the names of victims like Amina Jones reverberated in chants that echoed across neighborhoods. News outlets followed every development, cameras capturing the fiery speeches of activists and the weary faces of those who had carried pain in silence for too long. Inside his modest home, Jack Langston was a man unmoored. His routine, once rigid and purposeful, now felt meaningless. His badge and gun, the symbols of authority he had so long relied upon, sat on his kitchen table like relics of a life he no longer recognized. He had always believed himself a man of principles, a protector of order, but the events of that night had torn his identity apart. For the first time, Jack was beginning to realize that the authority he wielded had come at a cost, not only to others but to himself. The call that changed everything. Jack's phone buzzed incessantly, pulling him from his reverie. He considered ignoring it, but reluctantly answered when he recognized the voice on the other end. Captain Morales. "Langston," she began, her tone terse, "I hope you're watching the news. This situation isn't going away. The city's demanding answers, and you're at the center of it." "I didn't break any laws," Jack replied defensively, though the words felt hollow. "I followed protocol." "Protocol?" Morales snapped. "Is that what you're going to tell the mayor? The media? That you tasered a girl on crutches and shot her horse because of protocol? You need to wake up, Jack. This isn't about you anymore. It's about what you represent." Jack's grip tightened on the phone. "So, what? I'm just the scapegoat." "Maybe you should be," Morales said bluntly. "If you've got any sense left, you'll start figuring out how to make this right." Before he could respond, the line went dead. Jack threw the phone onto the couch and sank into a chair, his mind racing. He thought about the protests, the signs, the slogans. For years, he had seen people like them as adversaries. But now their voices felt like mirrors, reflecting back truths he wasn't ready to face. Amina's voice. Meanwhile, Amina Jones sat at the edge of her hospital bed, her crutches leaning against the wall. Her body was healing, but the emotional wounds felt far deeper. The loss of Princess weighed on her like a physical ache, and the memory of that night replayed in her mind like a cruel loop. She had been inundated with requests. Journalists wanting interviews, activists seeking her presence at rallies, lawyers offering to take her case. She had given a single statement through her lawyer, a heartfelt but measured plea for accountability and change. But now, as she watched the protests unfold on her phone, she realized that her voice had become a symbol, one she wasn't sure she was ready to embody. Her best friend, Layla, entered the room carrying a tray with tea and a plate of toast. "You should eat," Layla said gently, placing the tray on the small table beside the bed. "I'm not hungry," Amina replied, her gaze fixed on the screen. Layla sighed, sitting beside her. "Amina, you're not alone in this. The whole city is behind you. Look at what you've started." "I didn't start anything," Amina said quietly. "I didn't want this. I just wanted to be left alone. And now you have a chance to make sure no one else goes through what you did," Layla said firmly. "You have the power to make them listen." Amina looked at her friend, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "What if I can't? What if it's too much?" Layla placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then you take it one step at a time, like you always have." The protest escalates. That evening, the protests reached a boiling point. Thousands had gathered outside the Lekun City Police Department, their chants echoing through the night. Tensions were high, with police officers in riot gear forming a barricade between the demonstrators and the building. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and the faint acridity of tear gas lingering from earlier clashes. Elena Rivera, one of the lead organizers, took to the makeshift stage. Her voice carried through the crowd as she spoke with fiery conviction. "This isn't just about Amina Jones. This is about every single person who has suffered under a system that values power over people. Tonight, we stand together to say, no more." The crowd roared in response, their voices merging into a singular, thunderous force. Signs waved in the air, bearing slogans like "End Police Brutality" and "Justice for Amina." Among the crowd was Amina herself, escorted by Layla and a small group of supporters. She had hesitated to come, but as she looked around at the sea of faces, she felt a flicker of hope. These people weren't just fighting for her. They were fighting for something bigger. Amina stepped forward, the crowd parting to make way for her. The microphone was handed to her, and for a moment, she hesitated. The weight of so many eyes on her was overwhelming. But then she took a deep breath, her voice steady as she spoke. "I didn't want to be here," she began, her words quiet but firm. I didn't want to lose my horse, my friend, my sense of safety. But I'm here because I know I'm not the only one. I'm here because this isn't just about me. It's about all of us." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers reverberating through the night. Amina continued, her confidence growing with every word. "We deserve better. We deserve a system that protects us, not one that destroys us. And we won't stop until we get it." Jack's breaking point. Miles away, Jack Langston sat in his darkened living room, watching the protest on the news. The sight of Amina on the screen, her words filled with a quiet strength, hit him like a punch to the gut. He had convinced himself that he was right, that his actions had been justified. But now, confronted with her humanity, her courage, he could no longer ignore the cracks in his beliefs. Jack's mind drifted back to his childhood, to his father's voice drilling into him the idea that strength was all that mattered. His father had been a man of rigid rules and cold discipline, a man who had shaped Jack into who he was. But now, for the first time, Jack questioned whether his father had been wrong. He thought about Amina's face that night, the terror in her eyes as she pleaded with him. He thought about the horse, its defiant stance before he pulled the trigger. And he thought about the crowd outside the station, their voices a powerful tide demanding change. Jack stood, pacing the room. He felt trapped, his thoughts racing in circles. He needed to do something, anything, to make sense of the chaos inside him. He grabbed his coat and keys, heading for the door. A chance encounter. Jack drove aimlessly, the streets of Lecan City eerily quiet away from the protests. He wasn't sure where he was going until he found himself outside Millstone Park. The sight of the park, illuminated by the dim glow of streetlights, brought a lump to his throat. He parked and got out, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached the spot where Amina's horse had fallen. The makeshift memorial was still there, though many of the flowers had wilted. Candles flickered in the breeze, their flames fragile yet resilient. Jack knelt beside the memorial, his hand brushing against a photo of Amina and Princess. He felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him, heavier than it had ever been. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so damn sorry." For the first time in years, Jack Langston allowed himself to feel the full weight of his guilt. And as he knelt there, in the silence of the park, he realized that redemption wasn't something he could demand or expect. It was something he would have to earn. A path toward redemption. The morning after Jack Langston's quiet visit to Millstone Park, a cold rain fell over Lecan City, washing away the remnants of summer. The streets were subdued, as though the city itself was reflecting the growing tension within its borders. But for Jack, the rain didn't offer any sense of cleansing. Instead, it heightened the gnawing unease in his chest. Sitting in his dimly lit living room, Jack replayed the events of the last 2 weeks in his mind. He couldn't escape Amina's face, her trembling voice, or the protesters' chants that seemed to echo in his head, even when the streets outside were silent. His world, once so rigid and certain, now felt fractured and unsteady. Amina's next step. Across town, Amina sat at a long table in a small community center, surrounded by local activists and supporters. The room buzzed with energy as plans were laid out for the next protest, one that would march straight to City Hall. Amina had been hesitant to take on such a public role, but as the days passed, she realized that her story had become bigger than her. She couldn't ignore the overwhelming tide of support and expectation. Elena Rivera, the lead organizer, placed a gentle hand on Amina's shoulder. "You're doing something incredible," Elena said, her voice warm but firm. "You're giving people hope." Amina glanced at the handwritten notes in front of her, a speech she had been working on for the next rally. "It doesn't feel incredible," she admitted. "It feels terrifying." "That's how you know it's important," Elena replied. "Change doesn't happen without fear, and you don't have to do this alone." Amina nodded, her fingers tracing the edges of her crutches. Though the support of the community buoyed her, the weight of responsibility pressed down heavily. She couldn't shake the image of Princess, or the anger she still felt toward Jack Langston. Forgiving him seemed impossible, and yet a small part of her wondered if holding on to that anger was keeping her from moving forward. Jack's first steps. Jack wasn't sure why he drove to the community center that day. Perhaps it was guilt, or perhaps it was the hope of finding some way to make amends. He parked his car a block away and approached the building on foot, the sound of rain mingling with the distant hum of voices inside. Through the glass doors, he saw the crowd of activists and volunteers. His heart pounded as he caught sight of Amina, her presence commanding attention despite her quiet demeanor. She was speaking to the group, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. Jack hesitated. He wanted to turn around, to walk away and let her have the peace he had taken from her. But he knew that avoiding her wouldn't ease the burden he carried. Steeling himself, he stepped inside. The room fell silent as soon as Jack entered. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and dozens of eyes turned toward him. Amina froze, her hands gripping the edges of the table as she stared at him in disbelief. Elena Rivera was the first to break the silence. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her tone sharp and distrustful. Jack raised his hands, palms outward, as though to show he meant no harm. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, his voice low and measured. I need to talk to Amina." "You've done enough," Elena shot back, stepping protectively in front of Amina. "She doesn't owe you anything." "I know," Jack replied, his gaze dropping to the floor. "She doesn't owe me anything. But I owe her." Amina's voice, calm but laced with steel, cut through the tension. "Let him speak." Elena hesitated, glancing at Amina with concern. But Amina nodded, her eyes never leaving Jack's. Reluctantly, Elena stepped aside, though the room remained thick with suspicion. Jack approached slowly, every step feeling like a test of his resolve. He stopped a few feet away from Amina, his hands trembling at his sides. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "What I did to you, to Princess, it was wrong. I can't undo it, and I can't ask you to forget it. But I need you to know that I'm sorry." Amina's expression remained unreadable, her eyes locked on his. The room was so quiet that the rain tapping against the windows sounded deafening. "I spent my entire career thinking I was doing the right thing," Jack continued, his words spilling out in a rush. "I thought I was protecting people. But I wasn't. I see that now. And I see what I've taken from you, your friend, your sense of safety. I don't know how to make it right, but I want to try." The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. Jack felt the weight of every gaze in the room, but none more than Amina's. Finally, she spoke. "Why now?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with quiet anger. "Why are you just realizing this now?" Jack hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because I couldn't ignore it anymore," he admitted. "Because I saw what I'd become, and it terrified me." Amina studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she leaned forward, her tone sharp and unwavering. "If you're serious about making amends, it's not about words. It's about what you do. Show me. Show all of us." Jack's commitment. The next day, Jack returned to the community center, this time dressed in plain clothes and carrying a box of supplies. He had spent the night researching ways to support the cause, from volunteering at shelters to joining advocacy efforts. He knew it wouldn't erase his past, but he hoped it was a start. When he walked inside, the reception was still icy, but no one stopped him. Amina watched from across the room as he quietly unpacked the supplies and began helping with the preparations for the next protest. She didn't approach him, but her eyes followed his movements, searching for signs of sincerity. Over the next several weeks, Jack continued to show up, not just at the community center, but at rallies, cleanup events, and volunteer shifts at the animal shelter where Amina had once worked. He kept his head down, letting his actions speak louder than his words. The hostility from others didn't bother him. In fact, he welcomed it. He knew he deserved it. Amina's decision. One evening, After a particularly long day of organizing, Amina found herself standing outside the community center, staring at the rain-soaked streets. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Jack, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. "You're still here," she said, her tone neutral. "I'm not going anywhere," Jack replied simply. They stood in silence for a moment, the rain falling softly around them. Finally, Amina spoke. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I see that you're trying, and that means something." Jack nodded, his throat tight. "That's all I can ask." As Amina turned and walked away, Jack felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step, a fragile, tentative step towards something better. The reckoning. The protests in Laken City showed no signs of slowing down. Crowds swelled daily, their voices uniting in chants for justice and reform. The media attention had only grown, drawing national focus to Amina Jom's story and the systemic issues it highlighted. What had begun as outrage over one night in Millstone Park had evolved into a citywide movement. Amina, though reluctant at first, had become the face of that movement. She was no longer just a victim. She was a symbol of resilience and change. Her days were consumed with meetings, speeches, and interviews, while her nights were restless, haunted by memories of Princess and the trauma she couldn't yet articulate. Jack faces his past. Jack Langston stood in his small kitchen, staring at the cold cup of coffee in his hands. His once steady life had been turned upside down, and the man he saw in the mirror each morning felt like a stranger. He was still grappling with the realization that the very system he had served and defended might be as flawed as the people it targeted. His resignation from the police force had been met with mixed reactions. Some colleagues saw it as an admission of guilt, others as a betrayal. Jack didn't care. He knew he couldn't wear the uniform anymore, not after what he had done, not after what he had seen. The badge, once a symbol of pride, now felt like a weight he couldn't bear. Determined to take responsibility for his actions, Jack had begun attending community meetings and volunteering at shelters. He had apologized to Amina in front of dozens of witnesses, but he knew words alone couldn't erase the pain he had caused. He worked quietly, humbly, avoiding the spotlight as much as possible. But one night, as he was leaving the community center, he found himself cornered by a group of activists. Their leader, a tall man with a stern expression, stepped forward. "You think you can just show up here and pretend you're one of us now?" the man demanded. "You think a few good deeds erase what you've done?" Jack didn't flinch. "No," he said simply. "I don't think I can erase it. I just want to help fix what I broke." The man scoffed, shaking his head. "You can't fix it. Some things can't be undone." Jack nodded, his gaze steady. "I know, but I have to try." The man stared at him for a long moment before stepping aside. "We'll see," he muttered, his tone heavy with skepticism. Amina's struggles. While Jack fought to redeem himself, Amina was battling her own demons. The constant attention was draining, and the weight of being the symbol for so many people felt unbearable at times. She wanted to make a difference, but she also wanted to grieve, to mourn Princess, to process what had happened to her. One night, after a long meeting, Amina sat alone in her apartment, her crutches leaning against the wall. She stared at a photo of Princess on her phone, her heart aching with the loss. Tears blurred her vision as she replayed the events of that night, the sound of the gunshot echoing in her mind. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. It was a message from Layla. "Layla, hey, how are you holding up? Need me to come over?" Amina hesitated before typing back. "Amina, I'm okay, just tired. Thanks for checking in." She put the phone down and closed her eyes, taking slow, deep breaths. She wasn't okay, but she didn't know how to admit that, not to Layla, not to herself. Jack's unexpected encounter. One rainy afternoon, Jack found himself back at Millstone Park. He hadn't intended to go there, but his feet seemed to carry him there of their own accord. The makeshift memorial for Princess was still there, though many of the flowers had wilted, and the candles had long since burned out. As he stood there, lost in thought, he heard the sound of crutches on gravel. He turned and saw Amina approaching, her expression a mixture of surprise and wariness. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice even but guarded. Jack hesitated before answering. "I come here sometimes," he admitted, "to remind myself of what I did, of what I need to make right." Amina studied him, her gaze piercing. "And what do you think you're going to find here?" Jack shrugged. "Maybe nothing. But I can't forget it. I don't want to." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain fell softly around them, the only sound in the otherwise still park. Finally, Amina sighed and leaned against her crutches. "You can't undo what you did," she said quietly, "no matter how much you try." "I know," Jack replied, "but I can try to be better, to help others, to make sure it doesn't happen again." Amina looked away, her expression unreadable. "It's not just about what you do for others," she said. "It's about what you do for yourself. You have to figure out who you are now." Jack nodded, her words hitting deeper than she might have intended. "I'm trying," he said softly. "Every day, I'm trying. A new understanding." Over the next few weeks, Jack and Amina found themselves crossing paths more frequently. At first, their interactions were brief and strained, but gradually, a fragile truce began to form. They spoke in short, hesitant exchanges, their conversations peppered with silences that spoke louder than words. One day, as they worked side by side at an animal shelter, Amina finally broke the silence. "Why did you become a cop?" she asked, her tone neutral but curious. Jack paused, considering her question. "My father," he said finally. "He believed in authority, in control. I thought being a cop was the best way to live up to his expectations." "And now?" Amina pressed. Jack sighed. "Now I see how much harm that mindset caused. I thought I was protecting people, but I was really just protecting an idea of order that didn't include everyone." Amina nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "It's not easy to unlearn something you've believed your whole life." "No, it's not," Jack agreed. "But I'm trying." A city transformed. The protests eventually led to tangible change. The city council implemented new policies for police accountability, and a civilian oversight board was established. The movement had forced Lecan City to confront its flaws, and while the road ahead was long, there was a sense of hope that hadn't existed before. For Amina, the fight was far from over. She continued to speak out, to advocate for reform, and to push for justice. But she also allowed herself moments of quiet, moments to grieve and heal. And for Jack, the journey was just beginning. He knew he would never fully atone for what he had done, but he also knew that redemption wasn't a destination. It was a process, one he was committed to for the rest of his life. Seeds of change. The sun rose over Lecan City, casting a warm, golden light that felt almost out of place in a town still grappling with the echoes of turmoil. For weeks, protests had rattled its foundations, forcing change that many thought impossible. Streets that once echoed with the cries of anger and chants for justice were now quieter, but the tension lingered, simmering beneath the surface. Lecan City wasn't healed, but it was moving forward, step by step. For Amina Jones, life after the protests was a complicated blend of hope and exhaustion. She had become a symbol of resilience, but the weight of that responsibility bore heavily on her. She still carried the scars, physical and emotional, of that night in Millstone Park, but she was no longer alone. The city had rallied around her, and through her pain, she had found a sense of purpose, a public reckoning. At the heart of the city's transformation was a public hearing, broadcast live to every corner of Lecan. The newly formed Civilian Oversight Board, a hard-won victory of the protests, was convening to address the actions of the Lecan Police Department, and more specifically, the case of Officer Jack Langston. The hearing took place in a packed city hall. Activists, journalists, and community members filled the room, their faces a mix of anticipation and skepticism. On one side sat Amina, flanked by her lawyer and supporters. She looked calm, though her hands gripped the edges of the table. Across from her sat Jack, his usually stoic expression softened by the strain of weeks spent in self-reflection. The chairwoman of the Oversight Board, a sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Marlene Harris, began the proceedings. Today, we are here to address the events that took place at Millstone Park and to ensure accountability. Officer Langston, do you have anything to say before we proceed? Jack stood, his movements deliberate and careful. The room fell silent as he approached the podium, his gaze sweeping across the crowd before settling on Amina. He took a deep breath. "I want to start by saying I'm sorry," he said, his voice steady but low. "Not just to Amina, but to everyone in this city who has been hurt by people like me. For years, I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now that I was wrong." He paused, glancing at his hands before continuing. "What I did that night, what I've done for much of my career, wasn't about protecting people. It was about control. About enforcing a version of order that didn't leave room for people like Amina. And for that, I'm deeply sorry." The room buzzed with whispers, but Jack pressed on. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I haven't earned it. But I want to be held accountable. I'm here because I believe this city can change, and I want to be part of that change." When he finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then Dr. Harris spoke. "Thank you, Mr. Langston. Accountability is exactly why we're here." Amina's voice. When it was Amina's turn to speak, she rose with the help of her crutches. Her lawyer offered assistance, but she waved him off, determined to stand on her own. She took her place at the podium, her voice calm but resolute. "I never wanted to be here," she began, her words carrying the weight of her experience. "I didn't ask to become a symbol or a voice for change. But after that night, I realized I couldn't stay silent." She turned to Jack, her expression unreadable. "Officer Langston says he's sorry, and I believe he means it. But sorry isn't enough. It doesn't bring back Princess. It doesn't erase the fear I feel every time I see a police car. And it doesn't undo the pain that so many others in this city have experienced." Her gaze swept across the room. "But this isn't just about one night or one officer. It's about a system that allowed this to happen. A system that needs to change. And that change starts here, with us." The crowd erupted in applause, a thunderous wave of support that seemed to shake the walls. Amina returned to her seat, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. A turning point. In the weeks following the hearing, the Oversight Board released its recommendations. Jack Langston was formally stripped of his badge, a decision he had expected and accepted without protest. The board also outlined sweeping reforms for the Lekon Police Department, including mandatory de-escalation training, increased community oversight, and policies aimed at rebuilding trust with marginalized communities. For Jack, the decision marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Without the badge, he was no longer Officer Langston, but he was determined to find a way to contribute to the city he had spent years policing. The shelter and the bridge. Jack's new path led him to the animal shelter where Amina volunteered. At first, his presence was met with suspicion and resistance, but over time, his quiet dedication began to break down the barriers. He worked tirelessly, cleaning kennels, repairing fences, and helping with rescues. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was meaningful. One afternoon, as he was repairing a broken gate, Amina approached him. She leaned on her crutches, watching him for a moment before speaking. "You're still here," she said, her tone neutral. Jack straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "Yeah, I guess I am." Amina tilted her head. "Why?" Jack met her gaze, his expression earnest. "Because it's the right thing to do. And because I need to prove, to myself more than anyone, that I can be better." Amina considered his words before nodding slowly. "Actions speak louder than words," she said. "You're starting to show that. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step. And for Jack, That was enough. A city reimagined. Over the months that followed, Lekan City began to heal. The changes brought about by the protests and the oversight board were just the beginning. Community leaders, activists, and residents worked together to rebuild trust and create a more inclusive future. Amina continued her advocacy, using her platform to amplify the voices of others who had been silenced. She still carried the pain of her loss, but she had found a way to channel it into something greater. Jack, too, found a sense of purpose. He became a quiet but constant presence in the community, helping where he could and listening more than he spoke. He knew he would always carry the weight of his past, but he also knew that his actions now could help shape a better future. The long road ahead. One evening, as the sun set over Lekan City, Amina and Jack found themselves at Millstone Park. The makeshift memorial for Princess had been replaced by a small garden, a peaceful tribute to the life that had been lost. They stood in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. "Do you think the city will ever really change?" Amina asked, her voice quiet. Jack looked out at the garden, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think it's worth trying." Amina nodded, her gaze softening. "Yeah, it is." As they stood there, the city around them hummed with life. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was moving forward, one step at a time. And in that small, quiet moment, there was hope. Forging a new beginning. The quiet of Millstone Park was broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. Amina leaned on her crutches, her gaze fixed on the small garden where Princess's memorial now stood. The flowers, vibrant and alive, were tended by the community, an act of collective care that had transformed a place of pain into one of healing. Jack Langston stood a few feet away, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. The weight of the moment hung between them, but this time it wasn't suffocating. It was a reminder of how far they had come. "I didn't think I'd ever be able to stand here again," Amina said softly, her voice carrying an edge of vulnerability. Jack nodded, his eyes not leaving the garden. "I didn't think I'd ever be welcome here." "You weren't," Amina replied bluntly, but there was no malice in her tone. At least, not at first. They stood in silence for a moment, the wind carrying the faint scent of flowers. Amina shifted on her crutches and turned to face Jack. "You know, I used to think forgiveness was about letting someone off the hook," she said, "about pretending like what they did didn't matter. But it's not. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of what they've done." Jack glanced at her, his expression a mixture of gratitude and regret. "Does that mean you forgive me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Amina took a deep breath, her gaze steady. "Not yet," she said honestly, "but I think I'm getting closer." Jack nodded, the faintest hint of a smile touching his lips. It wasn't the answer he had hoped for, but it was more than he had expected. A community transformed. The months that followed saw Lekan City continuing to grow and evolve. The reforms implemented by the Civilian Oversight Board were only the beginning. Community policing programs were established, led by officers who were trained to de-escalate conflicts and build trust with residents. Amina became a key advisor on these initiatives, her voice carrying the weight of her lived experience. Jack, though no longer a police officer, found a new purpose in the community. He became a full-time volunteer at the animal shelter, dedicating himself to caring for the creatures that had once symbolized peace to Amina. Slowly but surely, he earned the respect of those around him, not through words, but through quiet, consistent action. At one of the shelter's fundraising events, Amina watched as Jack knelt beside a nervous dog, his calm demeanor soothing the animal. She found herself smiling, a feeling of unexpected warmth rising in her chest. "He's not the same man he was," Lila said, appearing beside her. "I don't think he ever will be." "Maybe that's a good thing," Amina replied, her gaze lingering on Jack. "Maybe that's what change looks like. The long road to healing." 1 year after the incident at Millstone Park, The community gathered there for a special event. The garden, now flourishing, had been expanded into a small sanctuary for reflection and remembrance. A plaque was unveiled, bearing the words, "In memory of Princess, and as a symbol of hope for a more just and compassionate future." Amina stood at the center of the gathering, her crutches replaced by a custom brace that allowed her to walk short distances unaided. Her speech was brief but powerful, a testament to the strength of a community that had turned pain into progress. Jack stood at the edge of the crowd, watching silently. He didn't expect recognition or acknowledgement. He was there simply to bear witness. But as the event concluded, Amina approached him, her steps slow but deliberate. "You've been showing up," she said, her tone neutral but not unkind. "I told you I would," Jack replied. Amina studied him for a moment before extending her hand. "Thank you," she said simply. Jack took her hand, the gesture carrying more meaning than either of them could put into words. A new chapter. The sun dipped below the horizon as the crowd began to disperse, leaving Jack and Amina alone by the garden. The city around them was far from perfect, but it was moving forward. They both knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like they were walking it together, not as enemies, but as two people trying to make sense of a broken world. As they stood there, the faint glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the park, Amina turned to Jack. "Redemption isn't a straight line," she said. "It's messy. It's hard. But I think you're on the right path." Jack smiled faintly, the weight on his shoulders feeling just a little lighter. "So are you." For the first time, in a long time, the city felt quiet, not with the silence of fear, but with the calm of possibility.